Sarah Williams had always been different from other girls in her small town of Millbrook. While her friends dreamed of fancy dresses and tea parties, Sarah spent her afternoons reading medical books borrowed from the town doctor. Her mother often found her bandaging injured birds or helping neighbors with their cuts and bruises. When Sarah turned 18 in 1942, World War II was raging across Europe and the Pacific. Young men from Millbrook were leaving every week to fight overseas. The town's only hospital was desperately short of help. Sarah knew this was her chance. She walked into Dr. Morrison's office on a cold Tuesday morning. The old doctor looked up from his papers, surprised to see the young woman standing confidently before him. "Dr. Morrison, I want to become a nurse," Sarah announced. The doctor chuckled, not unkindly. "Nursing is hard work, Sarah. It's not like the stories in magazines. There's blood, pain, and death. Are you sure a delicate girl like you can handle it?" Sarah's jaw tightened. She had heard this question many times before. "I'm stronger than I look, doctor. Give me a chance to prove it." Dr. Morrison studied her face for a long moment. Something in her eyes convinced him. "Very well. You can start tomorrow. But don't expect any special treatment because you're the banker's daughter." Sarah's training began immediately. She learned to change bandages, give injections, and comfort patients in pain. The work was exhausting, but she loved every minute of it. She had steady hands and a gentle touch that made even the most difficult patients calm down. However, not everyone appreciated Sarah's dedication. Many people in the town believed that nursing was just a hobby for rich girls who wanted to feel important. They whispered behind her back at church and in the market. "Look at Miss Williams playing dress-up as a nurse," Mrs. Henderson would say loudly enough for Sarah to hear. "When the real work starts, she'll run home to Daddy." Tom Bradley, the mayor's son, was particularly cruel. He had asked Sarah to marry him the year before, and she had politely declined, saying she wanted to help people instead of becoming a housewife right away. This rejection had hurt his pride. "Sarah's just pretending to be useful," Tom told his friends at the local bar. "She's only a nurse, not a real doctor. When this war ends, she'll forget all about this nonsense and settle down like she should." Even some of the other hospital staff looked down on her. Mrs. Jenkins, the head nurse who had worked there for 20 years, often gave Sarah the worst assignments. "Since you're so eager to help," Mrs. Jenkins would say with a fake smile, "you can clean the bedpans and mop the floors. That's what new nurses do." Sarah never complained. She did every task with the same care and attention, whether it was changing sheets or assisting in surgery. Dr. Morrison began to notice her exceptional skills. She could anticipate what he needed before he asked. Her gentle manner helped patients heal faster. One evening, as Sarah was finishing her shift, she overheard Tom Bradley talking to his friends outside the hospital. "My cousin just got back from the Pacific," Tom was saying. "He told me some crazy stories about nurses trying to act like soldiers. Can you imagine? Sarah probably thinks she's some kind of hero because she can stick a needle in someone's arm." His friends laughed. "What would a nurse do in a real fight anyway?" one of them asked. "Bandage the enemy to death?" Their laughter echoed in the night air. Sarah felt her face burn with anger, but she kept walking. She had heard enough cruel comments to last a lifetime. Still, their words stung because she often wondered if she was making a real difference. That night, Sarah sat in her bedroom reading letters from her cousin Michael, who was fighting somewhere in the Pacific. His unit had been moving from island to island, pushing back Japanese forces. In his latest letter, he wrote about the brave nurses who worked in field hospitals close to the fighting. "These women risk their lives every day to save ours," Michael had written. "They're as brave as any soldier I know. Some of them have even picked up weapons when the hospitals were attacked. They're real heroes, Sarah. Just like you." Reading those words gave Sarah strength. She decided that no matter what people said, she would continue doing what she loved. She had found her calling, and she wouldn't let anyone's mockery stop her. The next morning brought news that would change everything for Sarah and the people of Millbrook. Dr. Morrison called her into his office, his face more serious than she had ever seen it. "Sarah, I've received a telegram from the War Department. They're looking for experienced nurses to volunteer for overseas duty. The fighting in the Pacific is intense, and they need medical staff who can work under pressure." Sarah's heart raced. This was the opportunity she had been waiting for, even though she hadn't realized it until now. "The work would be dangerous," Dr. Morrison continued. "You'd be stationed near combat zones, treating wounded soldiers under terrible conditions. Many people would say it's no place for a young woman." Sarah thought about Tom Bradley's mocking words and Mrs. Henderson's whispered comments. She thought about all the people who believed she was just playing at being a nurse. "Dr. Morrison," she said quietly, "when do I leave?" The old doctor smiled for the first time in weeks. "I was hoping you'd say that. There's a ship leaving from San Francisco next month. You'll need to complete advanced trauma training before you go." As Sarah left the doctor's office, she felt a mixture of excitement and terror. She was about to embark on the adventure of a lifetime, but she was also leaving behind everything familiar. Most importantly, she was about to prove to everyone, including herself, exactly what only a nurse could accomplish when faced with real danger. That evening, Sarah walked through the town square where she had grown up. She looked at the shops, the church, and the houses where people she had known all her life lived their quiet lives. Soon, she would be thousands of miles away, in a place where life and death decisions were made every minute. She passed by Tom Bradley's house and saw him sitting on his porch with his friends, probably telling more stories about how useless nurses were in wartime. None of them had volunteered to fight. They had all found reasons to stay home while other men went overseas. Sarah didn't stop to talk to them. She had nothing to prove to people who would never understand. But, deep in her heart, she knew that soon, everyone in Millbrook would hear stories that would make them think differently about nurses, and especially about Sarah Williams. The girl they had mocked as only a nurse was about to become something none of them had ever imagined. 3 months later, Sarah found herself on a transport ship crossing the Pacific Ocean. The journey took 2 weeks, and every day brought her closer to a world she could never have imagined back in Millbrook. The ship carried over 200 nurses, doctors, and medical supplies headed for the Pacific Theater. Sarah shared a tiny cabin with 3 other nurses, Betty from Chicago, Maria from Texas, and Helen from New York. They came from different backgrounds, but they all shared the same determination to help wounded soldiers. During the voyage, Sarah learned that she would be assigned to a field hospital on a small island called Tarawa. The Marines had recently captured it from Japanese forces, but enemy soldiers were still hiding in caves and tunnels throughout the island. The fighting was far from over. "Tarawa's a tough assignment," said Captain Roberts, the chief medical officer, during their briefing. "The hospital is just a collection of tents about 2 miles from the front lines. You'll be treating everything from bullet wounds to tropical diseases. The conditions are primitive, and the work never stops." When their ship finally reached the island, Sarah got her first glimpse of what war really looked like. The beaches were scarred with bomb craters and twisted metal. Palm trees stood like broken umbrellas, their tops blown off by artillery fire. In the distance, she could hear the sound of gunfire and explosions. The field hospital was exactly what Captain Roberts had described: a cluster of large green tents surrounded by sandbags. There was no running water, no electricity except for a few generators, and certainly no comfortable beds like the ones back in Millbrook's hospital. Sarah's first patient was a young Marine named Jimmy who couldn't have been older than 19. He had been shot in the shoulder during a patrol and was burning with fever from infection. His eyes were filled with pain and fear. "Am I going to die, nurse?" he whispered as Sarah cleaned his wound. Sarah looked into his frightened eyes and spoke with a confidence she didn't entirely feel. "Not on my watch, Jimmy. We're going to get you fixed up and back on your feet." She worked for hours, cleaning the infected wound, changing bandages, and giving him medicine to fight the fever. By the next morning, Jimmy's temperature had broken, and the color was returning to his cheeks. "You saved my life," he told Sarah with tears in his eyes. "I want to write to my mother and tell her about the angel who took care of me." Word spread quickly among the wounded soldiers about the young nurse who seemed to work miracles. Sarah's tent was always the busiest, not because she was assigned more patients, but because wounded men specifically asked to be treated by her. The other medical staff began to notice Sarah's exceptional abilities. She could spot signs of infection before anyone else. Her hands never shook, even during the most difficult procedures. Most importantly, she had an ability to calm terrified soldiers with just her voice and presence. Dr. Patterson, the head of the field hospital, was a gruff man who had served in World War I. He didn't believe in giving compliments easily, but even he was impressed by Sarah's work. "Williams," he said one evening after a particularly difficult day, "I've been doing this for 25 years, and I've never seen anyone with your natural instincts for trauma medicine. You're wasted in a small-town hospital." But Sarah's biggest test was yet to come. 2 months into her assignment, intelligence reports warned that Japanese forces were planning a major counterattack. The enemy had discovered the location of the field hospital and were planning to overrun it. "We're going to evacuate all non-essential personnel," Dr. Patterson announced during a staff meeting. "That includes most of the nurses. A transport ship will take you to a safer location tomorrow morning." Sarah raised her hand. "Dr. Patterson, who's going to take care of the patients who can't be moved?" The doctor's face was grim. "A skeleton crew of doctors and a few volunteer nurses will stay behind." "But, Sarah, you don't understand how dangerous this is going to be. This isn't nursing anymore. This is war." That night, Sarah wrote a letter to her parents back in Millbrook. She told them about the wounded soldiers she had helped and the lives she had been able to save. She didn't mention the dangers she was about to face. "I know many people back home think I'm just playing at being important," she wrote. "But I've found something here that I never had before. I've found a purpose that's bigger than myself. These boys are so far from home, and they're scared and hurt. If I can help them, then everything I've done has been worth it." The next morning, when the transport ship arrived to evacuate the non-essential staff, Sarah was not among the nurses waiting on the beach. She had volunteered to stay behind with Dr. Patterson and 12 other medical personnel to care for the 40 soldiers who were too badly wounded to be moved. As the ship disappeared over the horizon, Sarah felt more alone than she ever had in her life. The sounds of battle were getting closer. Japanese artillery shells were landing less than a mile away. She could see the fear in the eyes of the wounded soldiers who lay helplessly in their beds. "Don't worry," she told them, trying to keep her voice steady. "We're not going anywhere. We're going to take care of you no matter what happens." That afternoon, Marine scouts brought word that enemy soldiers had been spotted moving through the jungle toward the hospital. The Marines had set up defensive positions around the medical compound, but they were outnumbered 3-1. Dr. Patterson called Sarah into his tent. "Sarah, I want you to understand something. If the Japanese break through our defenses, they won't respect the fact that this is a medical facility. They'll kill everyone here, including the wounded." Sarah nodded. She had heard the stories from other islands about what happened when field hospitals were overrun. "I'm not trying to scare you," the doctor continued, "but I want you to be prepared. There are weapons in the supply tent. If the worst happens, you might need to defend yourself and your patients." As darkness fell, Sarah could hear the sound of fighting getting closer. Machine gun fire echoed through the jungle, and the orange glow of explosions lit up the night sky. The wounded soldiers in her tent were awake and terrified. "Nurse Williams," called out Corporal Davis, a young man from Georgia who had lost his left leg to a landmine, "are we going to be okay?" Sarah moved from bed to bed, checking on each patient, adjusting their medicine, and speaking words of comfort. "We're going to be fine," she told them. "The Marines are out there protecting us, and I'm not going to let anything happen to you." But even as she spoke those reassuring words, Sarah could see Japanese soldiers moving through the tree line at the edge of the camp. The final battle for the field hospital was about to begin, and she was about to discover exactly what only a nurse could do when the lives of her patients depended on her courage. The girl from Millbrook who had been mocked for wanting to help people was about to face the greatest test of her life. In a few hours, everyone would know whether Sarah Williams was truly the hero she had always dreamed of becoming. The attack began at 2 in the morning. Sarah was checking on Private Martinez, who had been brought in that afternoon with shrapnel wounds, when the first explosion shook the ground beneath her feet.
"What's happening?"
Martinez whispered, his eyes wide with fear. Before Sarah could answer, the distinctive crack of rifle fire erupted from the jungle around the hospital compound. The Marine guards who had been quietly patrolling the perimeter suddenly came alive with urgent shouts and commands.
"Contact! Contact! Enemy soldiers coming through the east side." More explosions followed, closer this time.
The tent walls flapped violently as the shockwaves passed through the camp. Several of the wounded soldiers tried to sit up in their beds, but they were too weak to move. Dr. Patterson burst into Sarah's tent, his usually calm demeanor replaced by barely controlled panic. "Sarah, they've broken through the outer defenses.
We've got maybe 10 minutes before they reach the hospital."
Through the tent opening, Sarah could see the orange flash of gunfire in the darkness. The sound was getting closer every second. She could hear Marines shouting orders and the heavy footsteps of men running past the medical tents.
"What do you want me to do?" Sarah asked, her voice surprisingly steady.
"Get to the supply tent and arm yourself," Dr. Patterson said urgently. "If they get past the Marines, you're going to have to defend your patients. These men can't fight back.
They're counting on us."
Sarah had never held a weapon in her life, but she nodded. As she turned to leave, Corporal Davis grabbed her arm with his good hand.
"Nurse Williams, don't leave us here alone," he pleaded.
"We're sitting ducks if those Japanese soldiers get in here." Sarah knelt beside his bed and looked into his terrified eyes. "I promise you, Corporal, I will not let anyone hurt you or the other men in this tent."
"That's a promise."
She ran through the chaos toward the supply tent, dodging Marine soldiers who were setting up defensive positions behind sandbags and medical equipment. The sound of gunfire was now constant, a deadly rhythm that seemed to shake the very air around her. In the supply tent, Sarah found a wooden crate filled with rifles and ammunition. Her hands trembled as she picked up one of the weapons. It was heavier than she had expected, cold and intimidating in her grasp. Lieutenant Morrison, the Marine officer in charge of the hospital's defense, saw her struggling with the rifle. He quickly showed her how to load it and how to aim. "The safety is here," he explained rapidly, pointing to a small lever. "Point it away from yourself and squeeze the trigger, don't pull it.
Most importantly, don't hesitate. These enemy soldiers won't show mercy to wounded men or medical staff." Sarah nodded, trying to absorb everything he was telling her.
Her nursing training had taught her to save lives, not take them. But, now, the two skills might become the same thing. She hurried back to her tent, the rifle feeling strange and awkward in her hands. The wounded soldiers watched her with a mixture of hope and fear. They had never seen their gentle, caring nurse carrying a weapon before. "I don't know much about fighting," Sarah told them honestly, "but I know everything about protecting my patients.
And that's what I'm going to do." The battle outside grew more intense.
Sarah could hear Marines calling for medical help, but Dr. Patterson had ordered all medical staff to stay with the patients who couldn't be moved. The choice was agonizing, knowing that wounded soldiers needed help while being unable to leave the men in her care. Through a gap in the tent wall, Sarah saw Japanese soldiers emerging from the jungle. They moved in small groups, trying to avoid the Marine defensive positions.
Some of them were heading directly toward the medical tents.
Sarah's heart pounded so hard she was sure everyone in the tent could hear it. She had spent months learning to control her fear when dealing with medical emergencies, but this was different. This was life and death in a way she had never experienced. The first enemy soldier appeared at the entrance to her tent just before dawn. He was young, probably no older than the American soldiers Sarah had been treating. But his eyes were hard and determined, and he carried his rifle like someone who knew how to use it. For a moment, Sarah and the Japanese soldier stared at each other across the tent. Behind her, she could hear the wounded Marines holding their breath. The soldiers' eyes moved from Sarah to the helpless men in their beds. Sarah raised her rifle, her hands shaking slightly.
"Stop right there," she said, her voice much calmer than she felt. The Japanese soldier seemed surprised to see a nurse holding a weapon. He hesitated for just a second, perhaps thinking that this young American woman wouldn't actually shoot him. That hesitation saved the lives of everyone in the tent. Sarah squeezed the trigger, just as Lieutenant Morrison had taught her. The rifle kicked against her shoulder with surprising force, and the sound was deafening in the enclosed space of the tent. The enemy soldier fell backward, his weapon clattering to the ground outside the tent entrance. Sarah stared at what she had done, her mind struggling to process the reality of it. "You got him, Nurse Williams!" Corporal Davis shouted. "You saved us!" But there was no time to think about what had just happened. Sarah could hear more voices outside, more enemy soldiers moving through the camp. The battle was far from over. 2 more Japanese soldiers appeared at the tent entrance within minutes. This time, Sarah didn't hesitate. She had found something inside herself that she never knew existed, a fierce protectiveness that made her willing to do anything to defend her patients. The rifle fire continued for another hour. Sarah moved from position to position around the tent, using medical equipment and supply boxes as cover. She wasn't a trained soldier, but she had something that military training couldn't teach: absolute determination to protect the wounded men who depended on her. When the sun finally rose and the gunfire stopped, Sarah found herself sitting on the floor of the tent, still holding her rifle. Around her, 12 wounded soldiers were alive and safe. Outside, Marine reinforcements were arriving to secure the area. Dr. Patterson entered the tent and stared at the scene in amazement. "Sarah, the Marines tell me you held off multiple enemy attacks by yourself. Is that true?" Sarah looked up at him, her face streaked with dirt and tears. "I just did what any nurse would do, doctor. I took care of my patients." But everyone in that tent knew it was much more than that. The young woman from Millbrook who had been dismissed as only a nurse had just proven that sometimes caring for people means being willing to fight for them. Word of Sarah's actions spread quickly through the Marine units on the island. Soldiers who had never met her talked about the nurse who grabbed a rifle and held off enemy soldiers to protect wounded men. Within days, her story was being told in field hospitals across the Pacific. But, for Sarah, the most important moment came when Private Martinez, the young soldier with shrapnel wounds, took her hand and said, "Nurse Williams, you saved my life twice. Once with your medicine, and once with your courage. I'll never forget either one." As Sarah looked around the tent at the faces of the men she had protected, she realized that she had found something more valuable than the approval of people back home. She had found the true meaning of being a nurse, not just healing bodies, but being willing to put everything on the line for the people who needed her most. The mockery and doubt she had faced in Millbrook seemed like memories from another lifetime. The girl they had dismissed as weak and naive had become a woman who could face down enemy soldiers to protect her patients. And she was just getting started. 6 months after the battle at the field hospital, Sarah Williams found herself on another transport ship, this time heading home to America. The war in the Pacific was winding down, and wounded veterans were being sent back to hospitals in the United States for long-term care. Sarah had volunteered to accompany a group of severely injured soldiers on the journey home. Many of them were men she had treated during various battles across the Pacific Islands. They had specifically requested that she be the one to care for them during the long voyage back to San Francisco. Among the soldiers on the ship was Corporal Davis, who had lost his leg but was learning to walk again with crutches. Private Martinez was there too, his shrapnel wounds healed but his spirit forever changed by what he had witnessed in combat. There was also Sergeant Thompson, a tough Marine from Louisiana who had lost his right arm but never stopped talking about the nurse who had saved his life during a different battle on Iwo Jima. During the 3-week journey across the Pacific, Sarah spent her days caring for the wounded men and her evenings writing in a journal. She had started keeping a record of her experiences after the first battle, partly to help her process everything she had seen and done, and partly because Dr. Patterson had encouraged her to document the medical innovations they had developed in the field hospitals. Sarah, Dr. Patterson had told her before she left the Pacific Theater, "What you've learned out here could revolutionize trauma medicine back home. These techniques for treating severe wounds,
the organizational systems you've developed for handling mass casualties. This knowledge could save countless lives in civilian hospitals. But Sarah knew that her story was about more than medical techniques. It was about what happened when ordinary people were faced with extraordinary circumstances. It was about discovering strength she never knew she possessed and finding purpose in places she never expected to look. As the ship approached San Francisco Bay, Sarah stood on the deck watching the California coastline come into view. She thought about the young woman who had left this same harbor 8 months ago, full of determination but uncertain about what she would find in the war zone. That woman felt like a stranger now. The Sarah Williams who was returning home had seen things that would stay with her forever, the faces of young men who died despite her best efforts, the grateful tears of soldiers whose lives she had saved, the moment when she realized she was capable of taking a life to protect others. When the ship docked, there were crowds of people waiting to welcome the returning veterans. Families held signs with the names of their loved ones, reporters took photographs, and a military band played patriotic songs. Sarah was surprised to see a familiar face in the crowd. Her cousin Michael, who had returned from the Pacific 2 months earlier, was waiting for her at the bottom of the gangplank. Next to him stood a man in a military uniform who Sarah didn't recognize. "Sarah!" Michael called out as she walked down the ramp, carrying her single duffel bag. "Welcome home, hero." The word hero made Sarah uncomfortable. She had never thought of herself that way. She had simply done what needed to be done. The man in uniform stepped forward and introduced himself as Colonel Williams from the Army Medical Corps. "Miss Williams, I've been hoping to meet you. Your reputation has preceded you. We've heard incredible reports about your service in the Pacific." Sarah shook his hand, confused about why a colonel would be interested in talking to her. "I was just doing my job, Colonel. The real heroes are the men who fought on the front lines." Colonel Williams smiled. "That's exactly the kind of attitude we need in our medical corps. Miss Williams, I'm here to offer you a commission as a lieutenant in the Army Nurse Corps. Your experience and skills are exactly what we need to train the next generation of military nurses." The offer was tempting, but Sarah had already made a decision about what she wanted to do next. "Thank you for the honor, Colonel, but I have other plans. I'm going home to Millbrook." The colonel looked surprised. "Millbrook? But, Miss Williams, you could have any position you want in military medicine. Why would you want to go back to a small town?" Sarah thought about the question for a moment. "Because that's where I can make the biggest difference right now. The war taught me that every person matters, not just the ones in dramatic situations. There are people in Millbrook who need medical care, and they deserve the best I can give them." The train journey back to her hometown took 2 days. Sarah spent most of the time staring out the window, watching the familiar landscape of America roll by. Everything looked smaller and more peaceful than she remembered. The farms and small towns seemed almost impossibly quiet after the constant noise and chaos of the war zone. When the train pulled into Millbrook's tiny station, Sarah was amazed to see that half the town had come out to meet her. There were banners stretched across the platform reading "Welcome Home, Hero Sarah," and "Our Brave Nurse." Her parents were at the front of the crowd, both of them crying as they wrapped her in their arms. "We're so proud of you," her mother whispered. "The whole town has been following your story in the newspapers." Sarah was confused. "What newspapers?" Her father handed her a stack of newspaper clippings. The headlines read things like "Local Nurse Becomes War Hero" and "Millbrook Sarah Williams Saves Lives in Pacific Battle." The articles told her story in detail, including quotes from soldiers she had treated and military officers who had witnessed her actions. "How did reporters find out about all this?" Sarah asked. "The soldiers you treated," her mother explained. "Many of them wrote letters home telling their families about the nurse who saved their lives. Some of those families contacted newspapers. And then, Michael wrote a letter to our local paper telling them everything you had done." As Sarah read through the articles, she realized that her story had become bigger than she ever imagined. Letters had poured in from across the country, from other nurses who were inspired by her example, from families of soldiers she had treated, and from young women who wanted to follow in her footsteps. But the biggest surprise was waiting for her at the town hall. Mayor Bradley, Tom's father, had organized a special ceremony in her honor. The same Tom Bradley who had mocked her as only a nurse was now sitting in the front row, looking embarrassed and ashamed. Dr. Morrison, now retired, spoke at the ceremony. Sarah Williams left our town as a determined young woman who wanted to help people. She returns as living proof that there is no limit to what one person can accomplish when they refuse to accept other people's limitations. After the ceremony, Sarah walked through the town square where she had grown up. Many people stopped her to shake her hand and thank her for her service. Mrs. Henderson, the woman who had whispered cruel comments about her playing nurse, approached her with tears in her eyes. "Sarah, I owe you an apology," Mrs. Henderson said. "I was wrong about you. I was wrong about what nursing means. You've shown all of us what real strength looks like." Even Tom Bradley eventually worked up the courage to approach her. "Sarah, I know I said some terrible things about you before you left. I was angry and proud and stupid. What you did over there. I could never do anything that brave. I'm sorry." Sarah accepted his apology gracefully, but her mind was already focused on the future. The next morning, she walked into the Millbrook Hospital where her journey had begun. Dr. Patterson, her former supervisor from the Pacific, had written ahead to recommend her for the position of head nurse. The hospital administrator, Mr. Roberts, welcomed her warmly. "Miss Williams, we would be honored to have someone of your experience leading our nursing staff. Your reputation precedes you." Sarah looked around the clean, quiet hospital where she had first learned to be a nurse. It seemed so different from the chaotic field hospitals where she had spent the last year. But she could see the potential for improvement everywhere. "Mr. Roberts," she said, "I'd like to implement some new procedures based on what I learned during the war. We can improve our trauma response, our infection control, and our patient care systems. But I'll need your support to make changes. Whatever you need, Miss Williams. You have complete authority to upgrade our medical procedures." Over the following months, Sarah transformed the Millbrook Hospital. She introduced new techniques for treating severe injuries, established better training programs for nurses, and created protocols for handling emergency situations. Most importantly, she began training other young women who wanted to become nurses. Among her students was Betty Henderson, the daughter of the woman who had once mocked Sarah's ambitions. Betty had been inspired by Sarah's story and wanted to dedicate her life to helping others. "Miss Williams," Betty asked during one of their training sessions, "do you ever regret leaving home to go to the war? It must have been terrifying." Sarah thought about the question as she watched Betty practice bandaging techniques. "Betty, I learned something important during the war. Fear is not the opposite of courage. Fear is what tells you that what you're doing matters. The more afraid I was, the more I knew I was exactly where I needed to be." A year after returning home, Sarah received a letter that would change her life once again. It was from the newly established Veterans Administration, asking her to help design medical care programs for wounded veterans returning from the war. "Miss Williams," the letter read, "we need someone with your unique combination of combat medical experience and administrative skills to help us create the best possible care for our nation's heroes. Would you consider moving to Washington, D.C., to head our new trauma nursing program?" Sarah stood in her office at the Millbrook Hospital, looking out the window at the town where she had grown up. She thought about the journey that had brought her from being mocked as only a nurse to being sought after as a national expert in medical care. She picked up her pen and began to write her response. "I would be honored to serve our veterans in this capacity. However, I have one condition. I want to maintain my connection to small-town medicine. Too many medical innovations stay in big hospitals and never reach the places where they're needed most." As Sarah sealed the letter, she reflected on how much her life had changed since that day she first walked into Dr. Morrison's office asking to become a nurse. She had faced mockery, doubt, and life-threatening danger. She had discovered strength she never knew she possessed and had saved lives in ways she never could have imagined. The girl they had dismissed as only a nurse had become a woman who proved that there was no such thing as only when it came to dedicating your life to helping others. She had grabbed more than a rifle when she decided to defend her patients. She had grabbed hold of her own destiny and refused to let anyone else define what she was capable of accomplishing. And this was just the beginning of her story.